Okay, I'm excited to introduce today's special guests, two local city administrators, Benjamin DeClue from Glendale and Kris Simpson from Crestwood. They're going to discuss the pros and cons of professional management in government. In St. Louis County alone, almost half of the 88 municipalities are governed by a professional administrator or manager. And they all subscribe to a strong code of ethics through the International City/County Management Association. So to help us better understand all these important issues, especially as we head into the November elections, please welcome Kris and Benjamin.
Hi, everyone.
Good afternoon. So, as Laura said, I'm Ben. That's Kris. We'll do a little more formal introduction here in a moment. We're going to go over a couple different things today regarding the pros and cons of professional management of cities and counties here in Missouri and really nationwide. It's our intention to talk about why you would want to have a professional government manager in place, exactly what a professional government manager is. A little bit about the history of the form of government. It's older than I think a lot of people think. Some criticisms or some cons of professional management, at least as they're expressed by people that are against the form. And then we'll wrap up and take questions from you, the audience. So please do save them for the end. We'll leave plenty of time for that. Next slide, please, Kris. So who we are, I'm going to flip this so that I just keep talking. I'm Ben DeClue. I'm the city administrator of Glendale. Glendale is a suburb of St. Louis County, sandwiched between Kirkwood and Webster Groves. In a previous life, I was actually an elected official. I served on my hometown of Crystal City, Missouri, their city council for 4 years. And that's how I got into the profession. We were hiring our first ever city administrator when I left. And that was sort of the project that I was spearheading for the city. And I was excited to do that. And people kept asking me, why aren't you interested in the position? And the answer was, I am. But it would have been wrong for me to apply for a job where I was also the hiring person. So I went back to school, got my master's degree, and wound up in city management and went down to the city of Lebanon, Missouri for a few years, where I was the assistant to the city administrator, then the acting city administrator for a year, before I returned here to Glendale in 2018. I'm very active in our statewide association, the Missouri City County Management Association. I was our president last year, and this year I'm our immediate past president. So I've really seen the breadth of different forms across Missouri, and I'm excited to share that information today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kris.
Thanks, Ben. As Ben mentioned, my name's Kris Simpson, city administrator for the city of Crestwood. I've been here since January 2016. I got about 11 years of professional local government management experience, having worked previously for the cities of Maryland Heights and Chesterfield. I got into this profession out of grad school. I went to grad school kind of at the height of the Great Recession in 2008. Knowing that I wanted to work in government or policy or in the public realm in some way, shape, or form, I thought maybe that would be education, maybe a nonprofit. And it was through the master's degree program at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, where I learned about city management as a career path. And the more I read about it, the more I realized this was something that was very interesting to me. It allowed me to make a difference in my community in a very tangible way. I get a lot of pleasure out of seeing parks get built or fixed up, and seeing roads be repaired, and just really administering an organization that's doing a lot of good in the day-to-day lives of people. And then obviously through my profession, got plugged in with the International City County Management Association and all of their values. And just like Ben, I'm very involved in our professional associations. Serve on the board of the St. Louis Area City Managers Association currently. I've been involved in committees with the international and state associations as well.
Thank you, Kris. So in order to begin this conversation, we kind of want to touch on some different terms or names that you're going to hear through this. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term city administrator or city manager. They're frequently used interchangeably, but there are some pretty distinct differences between the two. Under Missouri law, the city administrator is the chief administrative assistant to the mayor, and its powers come from powers that have been delegated from the mayor to that position. Whereas the city manager under Missouri law or under a city charter is actually the chief executive officer of the city, and has full, complete autonomy and authority over, essentially the day-to-day operations of the city. Professionally managed, we're very defensive of that term. For us, a professionally managed city is one in which there's a city administrator or a city manager, and they're hired based on their competency and their experience, not their political connections. The point of the position is to be there over time and not simply turn over as elected officials turn over, as you see in some organizations. Council manager, strong mayor, and mayor council are all sort of forms of government. Under the council manager, that's the form that uses the city manager. There's usually a city council. Sometimes they're elected citywide, other times they're elected by ward. And then the mayor in that instance usually is somebody on the council, and the position rotates each year. Occasionally there's a mayor that's elected citywide. However, they're usually fairly ceremonial in nature. They lack a veto, and they lack authority over the day-to-day operations of the city. Strong mayor sounds like what you probably think it is. It's a form where the mayor is elected, usually citywide. And in that instance, the mayor has day-to-day superintending authority over the city. You still frequently see this in small cities. You also see it in certain large cities, such as the city of Chicago, city of Philadelphia. And then there's the mayor council, and that's one that I think most of us are familiar with, where you have a citywide mayor, you have a council that's elected by ward, and typically you have a professional manager associated with that. And there's a power share between the three, and everybody endeavors to get along for the good of the city. So for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to be referring to professionally managed local government as being run by a professional manager. So we're going to go ahead and use city manager and city administrator, or director of administration if you're in Kirkwood, kind of interchangeably here. Next slide, please, Kris. So what's in a name? So the following characteristics are critical to professional government management. One, the position has to have direct responsibility for policy formulation on overall problems. We're elected based on our competency, based on our education, and based on our experience. And so I think I said elected, we're hired based on that. And, it's important that this position be removed from the politics, particularly partisan politics of a situation, and be able to work independently of those political pressures and formulate policies and make recommendations based on sound government principles. The position needs to have major responsibility for preparation and administration of the jurisdiction's operating and capital improvement budgets. So your operating budget is things like your employees, the different programs that you offer. Your capital improvement budgets are things like your roads, your bridges, buying vehicles, buying other large equipment. It's important that the professional manager have responsibility for formulation of those and recommendation of those budgets to the governing body. The position should have significant influence in the appointment of key administrative personnel. I think that's really important, that the professional manager have the ability to discipline, hire and fire employees, because if they can't, then the position's really just a political figurehead. And people then know in the organization and outside the organization, the professional manager really can't get things done when it comes to management of people. It's important that there be an ongoing and direct relationship with the operating department heads on the implementation and administration of programs. I can speak from my own experience. I meet almost daily with our department heads, and we talk about what their plan is for the day and sort of for the week. I'm in the office full-time, they're in the office full-time. It's important to have that relationship. In other cities where there's not necessarily professional management, sometimes you get kind of a part-time mayor who's in the office maybe an hour or two a day, if that. And it becomes difficult to establish that regular working relationship, particularly if there's a lot of political turmoil and the position keeps turning over. It's important that the professional manager was hired as a result of his or her educational and administrative background and qualifications. I can say that ICMA frequently studies this issue, and in the last sort of 20 years, the percentage of administrators and even assistants and deputies that have their master's degree in public administration or business administration has skyrocketed. I think it's up over 70% now. I know when I first started looking to enter the field, that number was in the 40s to 50s. Like I say, over the last 20 years, it's really skyrocketed as cities and our own profession have really placed a high premium on the education and the value of the training that you get through an MPA program or even an MBA program. We also see people that come into the profession from the military side, and there's a lot of leadership and administrative skill that you can obtain from that career path as well that translates fairly nicely into the city manager profession. And finally, it's important that the person be a member of ICMA and therefore has to adhere to the ICMA Code of Ethics. That code was adopted by ICMA all the way back in 1924, and it governs all of our membership, in particular the personal and professional conduct. That code is so important. I know it hangs on my wall behind me. That code speaks to things like being honest with elected officials and with the public, treating your position as one of a public trust, and working with all people in your community and not just the politically powerful or the few that are in charge. It also governs things like for instance, how you treat your employees. I know it sounds like common sense, but the code governs not having relationships with your subordinates. It governs things like how you should not accept for lack of a better term, bribes or side money. That code is available for anybody to see on the ICMA website at icma.org. I would encourage everybody here on the presentation today to check that out after the presentation is over. I think you'll find it interesting. Next slide, please. So professional management. I think the great question is, why have one? Why make that change? If your city or your county is currently governed by a so-called strong mayor or strong executive, why would you change to a professional manager? Next slide. So one big reason is that the position was created to address government corruption. There have been sort of no shortage of stories in the last 5-10 years about government corruption, unfortunately, in the St. Louis metropolitan area. We all remember Steve Stanger. He was eventually convicted. He's a convicted felon now of bribery and mail fraud. We remember how he abused his office and the powers of his office. And he felt empowered to do so in part because St. Louis County's charter really doesn't provide any oversight over that position by the county council, despite what some may think. It doesn't quite work in the same manner as Congress and the president. There's no impeachment provision for the county council to have used to remove him. It actually took him being convicted and being willing to step down to finally part ways with him. More recently, we've seen instances in St. Louis City. Lewis Reed, I believe, has just announced his plans to plead guilty to bribery charges. He was accepting bribes from some developer up in North St. Louis in exchange for using the powers of his office to benefit that particular developer. My sense of it is that if that was happening in that instance, it probably was happening in others as well. In addition to that, you saw several other members of the Board of Aldermen of the city of St. Louis be swept up in that same dragnet for the same crimes of bribery and abuse of power. Similarly, over in the county, we saw Tony Weaver, a county appointee, was recently indicted for abusing the powers of his office and attempting to sell his influence to influence how COVID relief monies were appropriated and spent within St. Louis County. Next slide, please. One big reason to adopt professional management is that it functionally ends the so-called spoil system. In too many instances, we've seen, dating all the way back to it, I'm sure people would remember from their history books, the Tammany bosses up in New York City. This sense that just because somebody wins elected office, that they then get to fill all these jobs in government. Professional management believes that people should be hired based upon their credentials, based upon their experience, based upon their education. And that's true not only for the professional manager, but it's true for the subordinates within the organization as well. Your Department of Public Works should be headed realistically by somebody with experience in construction or engineering. They should have a background in it. They should have some education in it. It shouldn't just be, somebody who is raising money for a candidate for elected office. And that's what professional management brings. It generally creates a system where people all the way down to, your summer help are hired because they are interested in government and they have some legitimate knowledge or ability to contribute, not just because of who they know. Next slide, please. So cities under professional management are more effective. We've shown through a series of studies over time, the latest being from 2011 from IBM Global Services, the cities are nearly 10% more efficient when they're operating under council manager than they are necessarily the strong mayor or mayor council form of government. In 2016, 2/3 of Moody's AAA rated local governments, that's their bond rating, were employed a professional manager. Your bond rating is extremely important. It shows one that your city's well managed financially, that it has secure assets, that it has secure reserves, and that it's not operating in an upside down operational sense where expenses are outstripping revenues. You frequently see bonds used to build large public facilities, do large road projects and things like that. Also, 75% of the All-America City Award winners between 2013 and 2016 were cities that are professionally managed. We're exceptionally proud of that. It shows that the people that look at the best and brightest cities out there are recognizing that part of that high level of service and that high level of achievement is coming from, in part, the fact that they're employing professional managers at the top. Next slide, please. Professional management, also brings obviously a high degree of management capability. Government is complex and it's only getting more complex. I'm not joking with people when I say that, I run a $6 million corporation. St. Louis County is like a $600 billion corporation. The city of St. Louis, has an exceptionally high budget as well. We obviously, run very complex services, including, inspection of new buildings, construction of roads and bridges. Professional management, really targets results and efficiency, in particular with those different services. Managers can have longevity if it's desired. There are frequently in St. Louis County managers that have worked 10, 15, 20 years. I know when I began in this profession, St. Louis County actually had the highest average of tenure of any county in the entire United States, according to ICMA. And it had quite a few 30+ year managers in place. You can contrast that to some elected positions that seem to turn over just every election cycle. The manager form really establishes a balance between executive initiative and legislative oversight because it really shares the power with the governing body, which really functionally is what you would consider the city council or the county council. So rather than just being concerned with the affairs legislatively of their particular ward, everybody has kind of an equal stake in the oversight of the manager's performance and in the services that are being provided city or county-wide. The position's politically neutral, and that's essential. That goes back into the ethics guidelines that we all follow. We're not allowed to express political opinion. Now, that's not to say that we can't offer advice on, say, whether a city should be pursuing a bond issue or a particular tax issue. We're allowed to present on that, but what we can't do is stand up and say, I think that Theodore Roosevelt should run for president, or that the Democratic Party is bad and the Republicans are good, or vice versa. It goes all the way right down to the fact that we don't even put yard signs in our yards for candidates because it's important that people know that regardless of their political leanings, that they have equal access to the services provided by the professional manager. Finally, it's also a safeguard against corruption. We talked about the corruption that was there from those unchecked executive positions in the city and the county. Bottom line is that the manager can be fired if there are issues that are uncovered through regular audits, through legislative review of programs that are going on. If there are problems, the council can part ways with the manager. It doesn't require some massive political shakeup. We all know that impeachments, even when they're allowed, are very traumatic things. Same with a recall election. It's politically traumatic for both the people seeking the recall and the people against it. Whereas the manager can be called in and informed that the votes are there to part ways, and an agreement can be reached, and a new manager then brought in with maybe a different personality or a different set of credentials that are perhaps more fitting for the challenges that are immediately ahead. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Kris for the next half of the presentation. Thank you for your time.
All right. Thanks, Ben. Take a drink of water. That was a lot of talking. Great job doing the overview of some of the benefits. I'm going to go into now the history and kind of the expansion of the city manager profession. And I always like to start with this image. Obviously, as it's labeled, it's from the city of Galveston, Texas in 1900, after what is still considered to be one of the most deadly natural disasters in U.S. history, a direct hit from a hurricane. And as you can see, the devastation was widespread. You've got a community at that point with the infrastructure that existed in 1900. No internet, roads were around, but they weren't necessarily all that durable, bridges as well. So you can only imagine just how devastating the recovery of this would have been. Leading up to the hurricane, Galveston was run in a more traditional, strong mayor or city council kind of form of government. And after the hurricane, the residents of Galveston decided to completely reorganize themselves. And so they reformed themselves and invented a new type of government. It wasn't the city manager form, it was the commission style of government. But this commission style of government is considered the predecessor to the council manager form, the professionally managed form of government. What they did in Galveston was they looked around at the citizenry and they elected various members of their community who had expertise in a particular area to be in charge of a particular governmental function. So they may have taken a prominent business owner and said, you're going to be in charge of the finances of the city. And they elected him to be a commissioner of finance. They may have taken an engineer or a construction firm and said, you're going to be the commissioner of public works. You're going to help us rebuild our roads and buildings. and so on and so forth. And so electing commissioners with specialization in a particular service area was sort of that step towards professionalization of the management of government services. They recognized that they needed to do something different to overcome this massive devastation that faced their community. Well, the experience here proved to be a good one for Galveston. They recovered from their hurricane really well. It went faster and better than they had expected. And it proved the concept that having a trained specialist running government was a more effective way to run government. Which again, it sounds logical and obvious, but it wasn't obvious at the time. And that trained specialist, the specialized administrator of government services, is a key principle that led into the formation of the city manager form of government. It wasn't much long after that that the city manager form of government came about. As Benjamin mentioned earlier in the presentation, we had boss systems and political corruption were rife in the urban cities of America, which were rapidly growing as people moved out of the rural communities and urbanized. And obviously, we also had a significant amount of immigration that was occurring at the same time. And so the cities were rapidly growing, and they were not up to the task of dealing with all of that rapid growth. And those conditions led a lot of people to become reform-minded and think about different ways of doing things. And so Staunton, Virginia, became one of the first city in the country, and really the first city in the world, to hire a professional manager to run the government functions. Before this, they were governed by just multiple committees of different elected officials, but they found it was being too difficult to administer the affairs of their growing and prosperous cities. Like many places, the condition of city streets was a major griping point. At the time, Staunton, Virginia's streets were described as this. It says, each of these streets had a single street car track on ties only at one side. The rest of the street was plain mud. In bad weather, wagons went hub deep in the mire, and it was a feat to make a crossing on foot. The sidewalks at one time had been cindered, but that was long ago, and they had given up the ghost of respectability and had sunk back into the mire in company with the streets. As for side streets, picture a red clay country road with a gully washed out in the middle, and you may know what they were like. So for a city that was trying to grow and have a reasonable amount of commerce, this was not a condition that could be acceptable for the community. On top of that, the financial condition of the city was poor. Year after year, the city was forced to borrow money each to meet their operating deficits. When things got at their worst, Staunton had actually borrowed more money than state law allowed the city to borrow. And so there were multiple petitions from the residents asking what had happened to the money. And there were no records were being kept for city expenditures. So just a picture of mismanagement. In 1908, the Staunton Council, after some discussion, they created a municipal director position, and they charged this position with carrying out all work of the city. So to their credit, the elected officials recognized that the task before them of fixing the problems in Staunton was bigger than they were capable of doing. These were all people who are prominent citizens, and they have their own jobs and their own responsibilities, and they recognized it was just too much, and so they hired a professional. Sumter, South Carolina was the next city they followed in 1912, and Dayton, Ohio is the first large city to hire a professional manager, and they did so in 1913. From there, the form of government spread. Galveston, from a few slides ago, which brought in the commission form of government, Galveston actually switched to a professional manager form of government, doing so in 1960. And today, over 85% of US cities, over 2,500 people in population, employ a professional manager, and 372 of the US counties do so above that. Now, we spent a lot of time talking about what's so great about this form of government, and obviously Benjamin and I are somewhat biased, being professional managers who saw the appeal of this form of government. But it's not too hard to identify, and obviously we hear some of the critiques of the form of government. So, for the sake of offering the other side, here are some of the criticisms that we're aware of. The first is that this form of government lends itself to extra layers of bureaucracy. You're creating another position between the elected officials and the levers of government, the staff themselves. If your professional manager is there and they are an insulator against political involvement, that means that when the political tides rapidly change, the manager could be an obstacle to that. Of course, the remedy would be discharging that manager and the council electing a new one, but it can be an extra layer if the function isn't working as it should. This next one is one that I encounter a decent bit, which is confusion among residents about who is actually in charge and accountable. Is it the mayor or is it the manager? We're actually in the middle of our Citizens Academy here in Crestwood. And after I went through my slides explaining the city manager form of government, one of the residents said, "Oh, that's interesting. I always thought it was the mayor that was in charge, and it sounds like the mayor doesn't do all that much." And, on the one hand, maybe they don't do all that much with the day-to-day operation of the city, but the mayor still has a very important role to play in our organization and in our community. They set the tone. They run the elected affairs of the city, the legislative affairs of the city, really, with a veto power and agenda setting authority. They have a significant amount of appointment authority in Crestwood. So, and then as far as the accountability goes, obviously it's more of a business-like arrangement where the city manager, the professional manager, is accountable to the governing body, much like a CEO would be accountable to the board of directors of a private corporation. Some critiques suggest there's a disconnect between decision makers and the voting public because managers are hired, whereas mayors and executives are elected. I would say to a certain extent this is true, although an effective city manager is going to be sensitive to how the voting public feels on a given topic. We serve everyone equally, regardless of political affiliation, but that doesn't mean that you discard how the public feels about a particular issue when you're formulating policy and making recommendations. It just means you need to take that information, but still apply your best professional judgment. Oftentimes, managers are selected from outside the city and therefore don't bring a wealth of community knowledge to the position. This can be a pro and a con, really. On the pro side, it's a way to bring new practices and ideas to the community, but sometimes communities have a lot of history and a lot of baggage, or maybe there's communities where there's racial tension. Those are important things for someone in the manager role to be familiar with. And if you're coming from outside the community, you're going to have to learn that, as opposed to someone that perhaps grew up within the community and would have that institutional knowledge of the community, so to speak. A final criticism is just that managers sometimes leave the job as soon as they get a better offer. And this is one the ICMA Code of Ethics actively dissuades. So if you're a member of ICMA, you commit to staying in your job for at least 2 years, recognizing that it's hugely disruptive to the public to have a manager leave 6 months after they get hired to take a job. So there are a few exceptions in there if a position was misrepresented or something along those lines. But generally speaking, as a member of ICMA, if you accept a job and you start working there, and then you have to stay there for at least 2 years. And obviously the ideal is you stay there longer, but there are some bad apples out there. There may be people who seek employment as a professional manager who do not belong to ICMA and therefore don't ascribe to the Code of Ethics, who could run afoul of this. So I'm going to kind of pivot to wrapping things up a little bit and just summarizing what we've heard before we get to questions from the group. From my seat, the way I see it, elected officials, because of the nature of elections being every 2 to 4 years, and because of the fact that a lot of places have term limits in place, you find that elected officials are tending to think in a 1 to 5 year time frame. They're not willing to make the unpopular decision that may be necessary. It might be painful in the short term, but long term, it's for the good. And that's because they're thinking about the next election cycle. And it's hard to break out of that feedback loop. It's really hard to find that transcendental leader who has the courage to stand up to the voting public and implement a vision. Plus, if they make an unpopular decision and they get voted out anyways, then the public votes in someone that reverses that decision anyways, and so nothing ever gets done. That kind of regular turnover, obviously there's a democratic principle there, but in an increasingly complex government environment with some of the problems facing our communities today, these aren't problems that can be solved in 2 or 4 years or even 8 or 10 years. Consistent pressure, the consistent application of effort to solve problems over 10, 20, and 50 years even is going to be what's necessary to address some of the challenges facing communities across this country and across the world. So having a professional manager who stays in place even when there's turnover in elected officials is one of the ways that this form of government addresses these issues. As Benjamin covered, professional managers will make the city more efficient and effective because you're hiring a trained professional on the basis of their qualifications. You're giving them all the authority they need to run the government in a business-like fashion without any political interference. As we mentioned, governing is increasingly complex. Elected officials generally don't have much government experience or management experience. Aside from that, having a professional manager means that your average person can be an elected official. That single mother who might be a waitress could run for office because she doesn't need to run for office on the basis of her professional qualifications and training. You've got a city manager that can do that. You just need to you need to vote for someone who's got good character, who's got good principles and values that the public can support. I think that a professionally managed form of government makes it so much easier for more people to get involved in government. As mentioned, it separates the politics from government. You don't run into a situation where a political opponent's street isn't getting plowed in the wintertime because the mayor doesn't like them. And it can still be responsive to voters because the city manager can be fired easily if that's the will of the council. If they're not running the city effectively, if there's corruption, as Benjamin mentioned, it's relatively easy to turn that position over if you want to. It's a really, being a city manager or administrator, it's a really satisfying job, but it's a challenging job. The environment is complex. Resources are precious. Everybody knows the baseline opinion of the public as far as taxes go is the lower the better. And so, we're asked to do a lot with a little, and change is the norm. Just look at the last couple of years. I started out 2020 thinking how that year was going to go, and it went in a completely different direction. And obviously that's a pretty, a kind of an exaggerated example, but even this year, as we're coming out of the pandemic, we're finding change, whether it's environmental, whether it's economic, or even smaller things like regulatory change from the state legislature. It happens all the time. Even though we are bound by our code of ethics to be apolitical, politics surrounds us. We're like an apolitical fish swimming in the political ocean. And so politics is buffeting us at all times. It's something that's ever on my mind. And we're always trying to maintain that balance of not crossing into the political realm so as to maintain the trust that political neutrality is supposed to engender. As you can see, we've got a variety of skill sets that are necessary in order to be good at this job. And at my level and at Ben's level, where we're managing cities that are complex, but yet not incredibly complex when you consider the scope of the city of St. Louis or St. Louis County or Austin or Phoenix or Los Angeles County, which are professionally managed organizations. The skill set to run a city like that is exceedingly rare, and it's an exceedingly challenging position. And you're doing that you're trying to apply your best professional judgment while you're still accommodating the vision, values, and goals of the elected officials who are obviously translating what they hear from the public at large into their elective office. So, the last slide here really is just, well, why don't we have one in St. Louis City and County? And how do we get there? And the easiest answer is a charter amendment. The St. Louis County and St. Louis City have their own separate charters, which is kind of like the Constitution for those governmental entities. And a few years ago, there was a charter commission in St. Louis County. They actually considered a proposal to go and switch to a professionally managed form of government. Unfortunately, didn't get enough votes to get out of the committee. That whole committee and its actions are another story for another day, but suffice to say, myself and Mr. DeClue and several other members of our professional community were involved and engaged and made an effort to do it. But unfortunately, we're not ultimately successful. But we hope someday maybe this idea will gain more traction and might be something that the voters of St. Louis City and County support. Speaking not just as a professional manager, but as a resident of St. Louis County, I earnestly believe that it would result in a better level of service for the region, and it would help us solve some of the problems that are facing us that are unique to St. Louis and St. Louis County. And that's all we've got. I guess we'll turn it over for questions. Laura.
Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Kris. That was a great overview, especially the historical context. I'm sure most of us are not familiar with all the history. Speaking for myself, I was on the Planning and Zoning Commission and then served in the City Council and the Creve Corps. And so I'd like to just kind of give a big shout out to the longtime City Administrator, Mark Perkins. He has been running things there for decades, and he's the consummate professional. He spared everyone, and I think he's just an example of what you've been talking about. So I'd like to open it up to questions and see if anybody has any comments, their personal experiences, or what they're looking for. Anything that anyone would like to add? No? Okay, so I have one question before we close. Oh wait, Randy's got a question. Okay, Randy, we can't hear you. Okay, go ahead.
Let me just ask Laura, who has oversight then ultimately of the professional manager? Is that the mayor and the alderman people?
Randy, I'm sorry, I couldn't quite understand your question. Benjamin, are you shaking your head? Could you understand her question?
I did. She asked
Okay.
who has the ultimate oversight over the professional manager, whether that would be the mayor or the board of aldermen or the city council. And I think the simple answer is it depends on the situation. City administrators generally are overseen broadly by the mayor, but always in all situations by the elected officials on the city council or board of aldermen, or what we refer to as the governing body. Ultimately, they were the ones collectively responsible for reviewing our performance, extending our working agreements, and hiring and firing of the position. But in some instances, the mayor doesn't have much authority over it. In others, the mayor has a ton of authority over the position, but there is always somebody over us. And it's always people that are directly elected by the people.
So it is in the case where the mayor is elected and the board of aldermen are elected, then it is a combo of both those.
That would be correct. Generally, as I said, sort of, I'm not going to call it day-to-day supervision because it's not quite like that. But general supervision is given to the mayor. And then obviously, because we work, broadly with the city council or the board of aldermen, they have, hiring and firing. I think if you look at state law and look at city charters, it always requires a vote by the city council or the board of aldermen in some capacity to hire and fire a professional manager.
Any other questions? I have one question myself. You touched on this, but I was going to ask you maybe if you could clarify this. you talked about the importance strategically, especially long-term, of the city administrator manager's role in preparing annual budgets. But in the end, the budget still has to be approved by the elected body. And I just thought maybe you could explain that a little bit, because that's one of the important processes that makes the process more accountable and more transparent.
Kris, I'll let you tackle that. You're a big budget guy.
Thanks. Yes, well, let's go back to Civics 101, maybe 102 class, which is the legislative body generally in this country, whether it's at the national, state, or local level, has the legislative authority, the appropriations authority through their legislative powers. So they control the purse, but the executive is generally shown a lot of, the executive branch is generally shown a lot of deference in terms of the spending recommendations and for carrying out that spending plan. Obviously, legislative bodies are, by their very definition, a body of people. It's a large group. The House of Representatives is 500 plus members. In Crestwood, my Board of Aldermen is 8 members. And if you had 8 people in a room to sit down and figure out how to spend $12–15 million a year, it would take most of the year just to figure that out. So having one person with the expertise in budgeting, who is carrying out the day-to-day operations of the city and who has that familiarity to prepare the budget recommendations, to have a process for prioritizing and ranking capital needs, that makes the budget setting process a lot easier and more effective, because obviously then the budget is tailored to the actual needs of the city, as in the opinion of the day-to-day manager, who probably should have the most say so in how the budget is formulated. But this goes back to the original question of oversight, which is where the legislative body comes in. And I know my budget gets scrutinized every single line, every single year. It's about a 4-hour meeting, and sometimes it stretches into 2 nights. And we spend a lot of time going through the budget, and I justify every single dollar I'm asking for to that group of elected officials, all in public meetings, all with public hearings and the ability for the public to comment on it and let us know what they think or what they need. And they take that all into account when they approve the budget. So it's an extensive process, but it works really well. And again, just speaking as someone who kind of cares about this country and how it functions, I feel really good about the process, because I think it has that appropriate balance of administrative effectiveness, but also making sure that there's an appropriate level of oversight and control.
You just said something that I think is also worth noting about the open meeting, and there are minutes taken. And because the municipalities are subject to the state sunshine law, there is a lot of transparency and accountability on that front as well, that isn't necessarily, for instance, in effect in other places. And it's one of the people can always go back and find out, well, what was said, who said this, how did he answer that question? And because it's always on the record. And I think that's also an important part of this professional governance issue.
I think that's a great point. It's important to note that, our political neutrality precludes us from, say, running a PAC or
Right.
having a campaign committee where decisions and expenditures can be made that aren't necessarily transparent. Everything we do by its very nature that's associated with our city is subject to that sunshine law and those state rules that
Right.
govern what we have to tell the people and what we have to do, provide.
Well, if no one else has any more questions, I think we're going to sign off. But thank you so much for going on the record and helping us better understand these issues. And thank you again for your time. And on behalf of the Merowith Center, thanks everyone for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.